Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into a text that, well, it's shaped civilizations, hasn't it? And it continues to spark some pretty profound questions. We're diving into the book of Genesis, but maybe not in the way you first think of it. Not as a science textbook, not as a children's fable, but as a collection of stories. Tales, really. And these tales offer some, frankly, astonishing insights into humanity, into the divine, and, our place in this whole vast universe.
Precisely. And these Genesis narratives, they're often misunderstood if you take them purely literally, but they're actually a treasure trove of wisdom. You have to remember who they were written for. It was a people, Israel, going through a really deep crisis. Defeat, distrust. They were struggling.
Right, so they needed something more than just facts.
Right, exactly. They needed principles, ways to understand their own lived history, their own struggles. So these stories, they help us grasp not just, where we might have come from mythologically, but what it means to be human.
Yeah.
Especially in relation to the divine, and maybe where we should be heading.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is to explore these famous Genesis stories. We'll tell them almost like tales, maybe for someone who's never read the Bible, or maybe for you if you're looking to understand that deeper message. We want to keep the conversation flowing, engaging, but still, serious and focused on the core content. So how about we start right at the beginning, Genesis 1. Let's unpack this.
The great beginning and its purpose, Genesis 1.1, 2.4a.
Okay, so picture this, a time before time as we know it. There was, nothing really formed. Just darkness covering this deep, formless void. And the Spirit of God is described as hovering over the surface of the waters. Then this powerful voice, God's voice, resonates. The command, let there be light. And boom, there was light. And God saw the light, saw that it was good, separated from the darkness, called the light day, the darkness night. That's day one.
And that rhythm continues, doesn't it? Day by day.
Exactly. Day two, God speaks again. Let there be a firmament, like an expanse right in the middle of the waters, separating waters from waters. He calls this expanse sky. Day three, another command. Let the waters under the sky gather into one place. Let the dry land appear. And it happens. He calls the dry land earth, the gathered waters seas. And again, God sees it's good. Then, on that same day, the earth sprouts life. Grass, plants yielding seed, fruit trees bearing fruit, each according to its kind. And God saw that this too was good.
There's a real orderliness to it, a deliberate building up.
Totally. Day four, God creates lights in the sky. Not just for light, but to separate day from night, to mark seasons, days, years, like cosmic timekeepers. So he makes the two great lights, the sun for the day, the moon for the night, and the stars too. And again, God saw that it was good.
You keep hearing that refrain, it was good. That's clearly important.
It really stands out. Day five, the waters come alive. God commands, let the waters swarm with living creatures. Let birds fly above the earth. So God creates the great sea creatures, everything moving in the waters, all the winged birds, each according to its kind. And you guessed it, God saw that it was good. Then he blesses them. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the waters. Let the birds multiply on the earth.
A blessing for abundance, for life to flourish.
Yes. And finally, day six. God says, let the earth bring forth living creatures, according to their kinds, livestock, things that creep, wild animals. And God made them all and saw that it was good. But the absolute peak, the culmination of this whole creation week is humanity. God says, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. And this is key. Let them have dominion over the fish, the birds, the livestock, all the earth. So God creates humankind in his own image. Male and female, he created them. And then he blesses them too. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion, manage it. At the end of this sixth day, God looks at everything he's made and the assessment changes slightly. It's not just good, it's very good. Very good. The whole picture, right? And then day seven, God finishes the work. He rests. And he blesses the seventh day, makes it holy, sanctifies it, because on it he rested from all his work. And that's the first account of creation.
Okay, so what's truly fascinating here, and maybe a bit surprising, is that this account, the one that opens Genesis, it was probably one of the last parts of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books to be written in its final form. Now, it definitely uses ancient materials, very old traditions, but the style, the way it's put together, scholars link it to what they call the priestly school, or P.
Priestly school, okay. So not necessarily the oldest writing, even though it's chapter 1.
Exactly. And its purpose, well, it had absolutely zero scientific interest in the way we think of science today. You really have to picture the context. The Jewish people, when this was likely finalized, were in a tough spot. They were tempted by Babylonian religion, feeling defeated, maybe even distrustful of their own institutions, maybe even their own God, Yahweh.
questioning if God was responsible for their troubles.
Precisely. There was this undercurrent of suspicion maybe God was responsible for their misfortunes. So, what they needed wasn't a science lesson, not a prehistoric blow-by-blow. They needed foundational principles. Something to help them make sense of centuries of their own history, their own experiences, so they wouldn't just collapse under the weight of their situation.
So this creation story was like a theological anchor, a response to their crisis.
Very much so. The primary goal of the sages who crafted this was, first and foremost, to completely liberate God from any responsibility for injustice, for evil in the world. They took elements from surrounding culture's creation myths, the ones often full of violence, God's fighting, but they transformed them. They used this poetic structure, the 7 days, to instill this idea. God created everything from the beginning with immense harmony and goodness, so the message is clear. There was no negative purpose, no evil intent in God's creative mind. Everything he made was declared good.
That emphasis on good really hits differently knowing that context.
Right. And this poem, this hymn, it repeats elements to really drive the message home. It's like a profound catechesis, a song of resistance for those tempted faithful, urging them, hold on to your faith in the one true God of Israel.
Okay, so what are the key elements of that resistance message embedded in the story?
Well, first, as we said, the absolute goodness of God. Unlike neighboring myths where creation emerges from conflict, here it's just God's powerful, peaceful word bringing things into being, stamped with good. No negativity in God's plan. Second, everything fits into a harmonious plan. Each element has a function. The sun and moon, they serve to light the earth, mark time. The plants, food. Every creature exists to serve a purpose within this whole, ultimately serving humankind, not the other way around. This directly contrasts with religions where stars, animals were worshipped, even received human sacrifice. God's intention wasn't that.
So it reframes the whole relationship between humanity and the cosmos.
Absolutely. And then there's the role of humanity itself. Man and woman, created last, in God's image and likeness. This was radical. In a world rife with injustice, inequality, people thinking they were masters, this story says no. God created male and female equally in his image to jointly administer his creation.
Jointly. So, shared responsibility from the start.
Shared responsibility, equal dignity. Being God's image wasn't just a status, it was a project for the human pair. Build that image by staying true to God's good plan without dominating others, without tyrannizing the weak or exploiting creation. And then there's the blessing. God blesses creation, which is exclusive to him. That's a message of hope for people feeling subjugated. And finally, the Sabbath rest, that seventh day. It's another invitation to resist.
Resist what?
Resist the oppressive powers that demand constant work, constant production. Even God rested. It's saying humans aren't just cogs in a machine. Rest is part of the created harmony, part of being in God's image. So you see, there are layers here. It's a reason to believe, to hope, and absolutely to resist anything or anyone trying to usurp God's good and liberating will.
Wow. Okay, so this first story, it's way more than just how things began. It's a foundation for faith, for hope, a call to resist anything that undermines God's good, harmonious plan. It really makes you think about that inherent goodness of creation and our shared role, male and female, in caring for it. It gives us this deep purpose beyond just producing stuff. So thinking about today, with that constant push for more productivity, more growth, how does this story challenge that? How are we doing a co-managing creation with justice, with equality? And how seriously do we take that idea of rest as maybe a form of resistance, a way to push back against a world that just wants us to keep going no matter the cost? That's a lot to think about, too. The paradise and humanization, Genesis 2.4b, 3.24. All right, let's shift gears slightly. Genesis chapter 2 offers another creation account, right? It feels different, more focused on humanity's origins.
Yes, it's often seen as coming from an older tradition, sometimes called the Yahwist or J source, though likely edited later. It offers a, let's say, more earthy, perhaps more anthropomorphic view.
So how does this second story unfold? It starts by saying, when the Lord God made the earth and heavens, things were still, undeveloped. No shrubs, no plants growing yet. Why? Because God hadn't sent rain, and crucially, there was no human to cultivate the ground. But then a mist, or maybe underground springs, watered the earth. And then the Lord God formed the man, the Adam, from the Adamah, the dust of the ground. And he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being.
That connection between Adam and Adamah, human and earth, is really fundamental in Hebrew thought. We are earth creatures.
Right. And God plants a garden, Eden, full of beautiful trees, trees good for food, and in the middle, two special trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God puts the man in the garden to work it, to care for it, gives him permission. Eat freely from any tree, except one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, with a stark warning. The day you eat of it, you shall surely die.
A clear boundary is set, freedom, but with responsibility.
Then God observes, it is not good that the man should be alone. He needs a helper, someone comparable, suitable for him. So God forms all the animals, the beasts, the birds, from the ground, same source as the man, and brings them to the man to see what he'll call them. And the man names them all, livestock, birds, wild animals. But the text says among all these creatures, he didn't find that suitable helper.
Interesting, isn't it? Naming implies a certain understanding, maybe even dominion, but it doesn't fulfill that need for companionship, for an equal.
Exactly. So God takes a different approach. He causes a deep sleep to fall upon the man, takes one of his ribs, closes up the flesh, and from that rib, God fashions a woman and brings her to the man. And the man's reaction is immediate recognition, maybe even joy. This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She'll be called woman, because she was taken out of man. The story adds a little note. This is why a man leaves his father and mother, joins his wife, they become one flesh. And it ends this section saying, they were both naked, the man and his wife, and they felt no shame.
Okay, there's so much depth here. First, that shared origin from the Adama, the earth dust. Humans and animals, we come from the same stuff. This explains, biblically speaking, why we often seem so similar in our behaviors, our instincts. We share this earthiness, this adamacity. The Bible names us Adam to remind us we're formed from Adama. And for the Israelites who knew violence, brutality, both suffered and inflicted, this was important. It grounds those wilder instincts in both humans and animals in the same primary matter, the earth, the dust.
But there's a difference, right? We're not just animals in this view.
Crucially, yes. The Bible distinguishes humans not just by having a body, but because God gives us something animals don't have, that image and likeness. And here in this story, that image starts to take shape when God breathes his own breath into the human's nostrils. That nishmat hayim, the breath of life. For the sages, what's truly human happens when God's spirit, that divine breath, inhabits us, making us capable of being, well, humanized.
Humanized. Oh, so it's more than just being alive.
Much more. It goes beyond simplistic readings. It opens up this vast potential for faith, for growth. It makes us reflect on the violence and injustice in the world, often links to that raw adamacity, that instinct to trap or eliminate obstacles. But crucially, the text reminds us, within that earthy vessel, there's also the presence of the Spirit just waiting for a chance to humanize us, to let us dream of a better way, a new society.
Okay, so there's this potential, this harmony in the garden. But then, things change. The serpent enters the scene, described as more cunning, more shrewd than any other wild creature God had made. It starts a conversation with the woman, casually questioning God's command. Did God really say you shouldn't eat from any tree?
Notice the subtlety, twisting the command slightly, planting doubt.
Right. The woman corrects him, explaining the one restriction. The tree in the middle of the garden, don't eat it, don't even touch it, or you'll die. But the serpent flatly contradicts God. You will not surely die. God knows, it claims, that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.
The core temptation. Be like God. Know good and evil on your own terms.
And the woman, she looks at the tree differently now. Sees it's good for food, pleasing to the eye, and crucially, desirable for gaining wisdom. So she takes the fruit, she eats, and she gives some to her husband, who is with her, and he eats too. And immediately, their eyes are opened. But what they see is their own nakedness. They feel shame. They sew fig leaves together to cover themselves.
That innocence is gone, replaced by self-consciousness, fear.
Yes. Because when they hear the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden, the cool of the day which sounds so peaceful before they hide, among the trees, God calls out, "Where are you?" The man answers, "I heard you. I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." God's question cuts right to it. "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree I commanded you not to eat from?" And then comes the blame game. The man points to the woman. "The woman you gave me, she gave me the fruit, and I ate." God turns to the woman. "What is this you have done?" She points to the serpent. "The serpent deceived me, and I ate."
Okay, this passage is absolutely vital for the biblical understanding of evil, but we really need to sort of unlearn some traditional interpretations that miss the mark. It's not about humans messing up God's supposedly perfect plan, as if God made a mistake. It's not about painting the woman as the sole temptress or the man as just a passive victim. That's often read into it, but it's not the core message.
So what is the core message, according to the sages who adapted this?
Well, remember, they likely adapted an older Mesopotamian myth, But they changed its reference point, its focus, to address their generation's questions about existence, about faith, about why things go wrong. Notice, crucially, the tempter isn't the woman, as it might have been in the original myth, it's the serpent. And the seduction isn't primarily sexual, it comes from the fruit being desirable for gaining knowledge.
Okay, so the focus is on that knowledge of good and evil. What does that phrase actually signify here?
In the Old Testament context, knowing good and evil isn't just about intellectual knowledge. It's about the power to decide for oneself what is good and evil. It's the attempt to be the ultimate arbiter, the measure of all things. So the story is saying, humanity's biggest temptation, our fundamental downfall, is trying to displace God, to put ourselves and our own interests at the center as the supreme standard, ignoring the divine reference point.
And the consequences of doing that.
History shows us, doesn't it? Whenever humans act like that, setting up their own interests, often institutionalized interests as the absolute norm, the result is inevitably the unjust sacrifice of others. It's evil manifesting as egoism, unchecked desire, tyranny. And Israel knew this firsthand. They'd lived under kings who sometimes, even in God's name, oppressed them. The story reflects that deep, painful experience.
So the story isn't just about the first humans, but about a recurring human tendency.
Exactly. Now, verses 14 to 24, the part describing the consequences or curses, that's likely a distinct layer added by the priestly school. It functions like a prophetic oracle. Prophetic oracles didn't usually invent new punishments. They took existing realities, hardships, catastrophes, and interpreted them as a divine reprimand, a consequence of straying from God's way.
Okay, so the serpent crawling, the pain in childbirth, the toil in farming, death itself. These aren't new punishments God suddenly invented.
The text presents them that way, but the deeper theological point, especially from the priestly perspective, is that these are natural phenomena, part of the struggle of existence. But within this oracle, they're reframed. They become symbols of the consequences of losing sight of God as the only true reference for right and wrong. It's a way of saying, these struggles are intensified or perhaps perceived differently when we disconnect from the divine plan and try to make ourselves the center.
So the whole narrative, from the temptation to the consequences, is aimed at what?
It's aimed at restoring God's absolute moral sovereignty. It's saying humanity self-destructs when it forgets that God, who is fundamentally liberating, is the only valid reference point, beyond our own selfish interests. When we displace God and put ourselves, our greed, our ambition in his place, our interests become the absolute rule. We twist language, call injustice justice, we impose our will on others. That's the profound message. It exposes the immense harm done by a perverted conscience, especially when that conscience holds power. It's the hidden dynamic of all tyranny, all totalitarianism. And our faith calls us to unmask that.
Wow, that lands very differently. It makes the story incredibly relevant. It's not just about Adam and Eve. It's about us, here and now. It invites us to really look at our own adamacity, our earthly tendencies, but also to remember that divine spark, that spear within, that potential for being humanized. It's like a lens for critiquing our own political, religious, even personal realities. Where do we see that temptation to be the sole measure? Where do we see powerful, maybe perverted consciences distorting truth? It really makes you ask, how do we respond to that fundamental temptation today? 3. Cain and Abel. Human rivalry and the origin of collective selfishness. Genesis 4:1 to 16. Okay, so after Adam and Eve leave the garden, life goes on, but the consequences of that broken relationship with God, and maybe with each other, start to unfold almost immediately, don't they? Adam and Eve have children. First, Cain, Eve says something like, I've gotten a man with the Lord's help. Then she has his brother, Abel.
Yeah.
And they take different paths. Abel becomes a shepherd, keeper of sheep. Cain becomes a farmer, tilling the ground.
Two fundamental modes of life in the ancient world, often in tension.
Right, and that tension surfaces quickly. In time, both bring offerings to the Lord. Cain brings fruits of the soil from his work. Abel brings the best of his flock, the firstborn, the fat portions. And here's the pivot point. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. We aren't explicitly told why, but the result is immediate. Cain is furious. His face falls. He's downcast.
That sense of rejection, whether real or perceived, is powerful.
And God notices. He speaks directly to Cain. Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it.
A direct warning. Sin is personified like a beast ready to pounce. But Cain is given agency. Rule over it.
But Cain doesn't listen. The text says he spoke with his brother Abel. Some translations add, let's go into the field. And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him, the first murder. Then comes that chilling exchange with God. "Where's your brother Abel?" Cain's reply is famously evasive, maybe even defiant. I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?
A question that echoes down through history, doesn't it? The responsibility we have for each other.
God knows, of course. What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground, and the consequence follows. Now you are under a curse, driven from the ground which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth.
The very ground he worked is now hostile to him. Alienation.
Cain cries out, maybe in fear, maybe despair. "My punishment is more than I can bear. You've driven me out. I'll be hidden from your presence. A wanderer, whoever finds me will kill me." But then, surprisingly, God offers a measure of protection. "Not so," he says. "If anyone kills Cain, he will suffer vengeance 7 times over." And the Lord put a mark on Cain, so no one who found him would kill him. So Cain leaves the Lord's presence, lives in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Nod meaning wandering.
Okay, so this story, like the Paradise narrative, is doing more than just recounting a family tragedy. There's evidence of older sources, like a Sumerian poem about shepherd and farmer gods feuding, so it likely reflects real-world tensions between nomadic shepherds and settled farmers.
A competition for resources, different lifestyles.
Exactly. And there's also that ancient religious context of offerings. Offerings weren't just thank you gifts, they were seen as ways to sort of secure the deity's favor for future productivity. So if your harvest failed or your flocks didn't thrive, you might interpret that as God rejecting your last offering and rejecting you. Cain might have faced agricultural failure, drought, pests, who knows, and concluded God had rejected his offering but accepted Abel's. The envy stems from that perceived rejection and failure.
But you're saying the story's intention goes deeper than just Cain's personal envy.
Much deeper. The Israelite sages are using this mythical, symbolic language again. They're using Cain's story to diagnose a root cause of the big problems, the major failures in their own history, and really in human history generally. That root cause, human egoism, selfishness, disguised in all sorts of ways, but ultimately leading to disregard for the other, even to violence. So the story isn't just condemning one envious brother, it's actually establishing the, let's say, the cursed origin of certain power groups that caused immense harm.
Power groups, how does this story point to that?
Look at Cain's descendants listed later in the chapter. You have figures like Jabal, the ancestor of those living in tents with livestock. For some, accumulating vast herds wasn't just sustenance, it became a tool for economic dominance, control over others. Or Jubal, the ancestor of musicians. The powerful often co-opt culture, don't they? Foster art forms that celebrate their own deeds, legitimize their power, maybe distract from their injustices. The Bible isn't condemning herding or music itself. It's condemning the unjust structures that twist these things, appropriating the fruits of culture or economy to serve projects of oppression, of death.
So Cain becomes an archetype for those who build power at others' expense.
In a sense, yes. And it culminates in that chilling song of Lamech, one of Cain's descendants. He boasts about killing a man for wounding him and proclaims, "If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times." It shows this terrifying escalation. Egoism, failure, rejection, they spiral into disproportionate vengeance, blood feuds, taking justice into your own hands with terrifying brutality. And you have to ask, isn't our own human history, the history of nations, filled with precisely this dynamic? That's the hidden mechanism of tyranny, of totalitarianism, that the story urges us to recognize and unmask, especially from a faith perspective.
Right. It's a clear progression. Individual sin leading to fratricide, and that dynamic hardening into oppressive structures, escalating violence. Not just about personal evil anymore. That's a powerful point. This story isn't just ancient history. It's a diagnosis of a recurring pattern. It denounces that hidden dynamic in all forms of tyranny. It really forces us to reflect, how do we see envy and egoism playing out collectively today? How do they get disguised as legitimate power or cultural expression, leading to devastating consequences? How do we recognize those power groups you mentioned, who might be building their success on the exploitation or marginalization of others? It's deeply unsettling. 4, the Sethites, the Nephilim and the flood, the corruption of humanity and the covenant of life, Genesis 4.259.17. Okay, so after the darkness of Cain and the cycle of violence hinted at with Lamech, the narrative seems to offer a glimmer of hope, doesn't it? Adam and Eve have another son, Seth. Eve sees him as a replacement for Abel, saying God has granted me another child in place of Abel since Cain killed him. But with Seth and then his son Enosh, the text says something significant. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord.
A new beginning, a lineage seemingly oriented towards God, in contrast to Cain's line.
Right. And then we get this genealogy of Seth's descendants, much like Cain's, but with one striking difference. These guys live for incredibly long lifespans, hundreds and hundreds of years. Adam lives 930 years, Seth 912, Enosh 905. It goes on like that.
Yeah, those ages are astronomical. And again, we shouldn't read them literally like biological records.
So what do they signify?
The sages use these exaggerated numbers as a literary device. They likely represent the quality of life, or perhaps the consistency of their connection to God's plan. High numbers might mean a life lived more in tune with the divine, lower numbers maybe less so. But the irregular variation in these ages, the way they jump around, is probably meant to create a mood, to set the stage for what comes next. The story of Noah and the flood. It hints at a growing instability, a decline even within this good lineage.
Okay, that makes sense. And then comes a really strange, kind of cryptic passage before the flood story proper. It says that when humans began to multiply and daughters were born, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. And from these unions, children were born the Nephilim. They were on the earth in those days, described as the heroes of old, men of renown. But God's reaction isn't positive. He sees this, and the text says the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. And it leads to this shocking statement. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So he says, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them.
Okay, let's unpack that Sons of God passage first, because it's often wildly misinterpreted. People imagine angels mating with humans, giants roaming the earth.
Right, it sounds like mythology.
And it likely draws on mythological motifs. But within the Israelite context, it probably refers to something more concrete, a social problem they experienced. Some scholars suggest sons of God might refer to rulers, nobles, the powerful elite, abusing their power and taking women as they please, regardless of consent or social order. Others connect it to the phenomenon of sacred prostitution, common in the ancient Near East, where rituals involved sexual acts, and the resulting offspring sometimes claim special privileges. Either way, the point is that these unions, these actions by the powerful or those claiming divine connection, contributed to the breakdown of social order, increased oppression, and fueled the wickedness God observes. It's another example of power corrupting.
So it's less about literal angels and more about human abuse of power leading to corruption.
That's a more likely interpretation within the flow of Genesis' critique of human sin. And then God's regret, that's another difficult concept. Does God make mistakes? Does he change his mind? Again, we need to understand this anthropomorphically. It's not saying God is imperfect or fickle. It's expressing the depth of God's sorrow and disappointment at the state of humanity. His heart is deeply troubled. It's a powerful way to convey how seriously God takes human wickedness and the failure of his creation to live up to its potential. It shows God's emotional investment, his pain at the path humanity has chosen.
So in the midst of this widespread wickedness and God's profound grief, the focus narrows. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. He's described as a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. So God tells Noah his plan. I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I'm surely going to destroy both them and the earth. But he offers Noah a way out. He gives him incredibly detailed instructions to build an ark, the dimensions, the material, go for wood, the designs, the rooms, 3 decks, coating it with pitch. And he tells Noah to bring his entire family, his wife, his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives into the ark. Plus, pairs of all living creatures, male and female, clean and unclean animals, birds, everything, to keep their species alive. Noah does exactly as God commands.
The contrast is stark. Widespread violence and corruption, and one righteous man following God's precise instructions for preservation.
And then the floodgates open, literally. Rain falls for 40 days and 40 nights. The springs of the great deep burst forth, the heavens open up, the waters rise and rise, lifting the ark high above the ground. They cover everything, even the highest mountains, 15 cubits, about 22 feet above the peaks. Every living thing on the face of the earth perished. People, animals, birds, creatures crawling on the ground. Only Noah and those with him in the ark survived, and the waters covered the earth for 150 days. A total reset.
A terrifying image of decreation almost, undoing the ordering work of Genesis 1.
Right. But after those 150 days, the text says, God remembered Noah and all the creatures with him. He sends a wind, and the waters start to recede. The springs of the deep, the windows of heaven are closed. The rain stops. Gradually, the water levels drop. The ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Noah waits. After 40 days, he opens a window, sends out a raven. It keeps flying back and forth. Then he sends a dove. It comes back, finding where to land. He waits 7 more days, sends the dove again. This time it returns in the evening with a freshly plucked olive leaf in its beak, a sign. The waters had receded. He waits another 7 days, sends the dove out, and this time it doesn't return.
The testing of the waters confirming the land is reappearing. Hope returns.
Yes. And finally, about a year after the flood began, the earth is completely dry. God tells Noah, come out of the ark, you and your family and all the creatures. Let them multiply on the earth. Be fruitful, increase in number. So Noah, his family, and all the animals come out. The first thing Noah does, he builds an altar to the Lord, takes some of the clean animals and clean birds, and sacrifices burnt offerings. And the Lord smells the pleasing aroma, and he makes a promise, says to himself, never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood, and never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. He promises the cycles of nature will continue. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease.
Okay, so the flood narrative. First, notice who is punished. It's not just Cain's descendants, the explicitly bad line. The flood wipes out everyone except Noah's family. This implies that even the Sethite line, the supposedly good branch, had become corrupted. This is incredibly important. It means the blame for humanity's sorry state doesn't just fall on obvious villains or oppressive groups. Even the good people, the lineage that began by calling on God's name, share responsibility for the failure of God's plan. In a way, this is a profound moment of self-critique for Israel itself. They saw their own history, their own exile and suffering mirrored here. They too, despite being chosen, had failed, had allowed themselves to be dominated by those selfish tendencies, that animosity, and had shipwrecked their calling to justice and life.
So the flood isn't just about punishing generic wickedness, but a reflection on Israel's own failings too.
Very likely, yes. Now, the story itself clearly borrows heavily from older Mesopotamian flood myths. The Epic of Gilgamesh has a very similar story, for instance. Widespread flood traditions existed, but Israel adapts it, reframes it. The reasons for the flood are different. In Genesis, it's explicitly linked to human wickedness and violence, emphasizing moral responsibility in a way the other myths don't. It underscores humanity's role in the world's misfortunes.
And the aftermath, the promise, the covenant.
Crucial. When Noah emerges, God blesses him and his family, repeating the commands from Genesis 1, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, care for creation. But there is a new emphasis, born from the violence that prompted the flood, a strong prohibition against shedding human blood. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind. It establishes God's absolute stance on the sanctity of life, especially human life.
So a reaffirmation of the original plan, but with a sharper focus on justice between humans.
Precisely. And then comes the formal covenant, the Noahic covenant, marked by the rainbow. God makes this promise not just with Noah, but with all living creatures and with the earth itself, the promise, never again a flood to destroy all life. The rainbow becomes the universal sign of this pledge. Now, theologically, this covenant text, placing all humanity under God's promise, is probably later than the covenants with Abraham or Moses at Sinai. It reflects a more developed monotheism where God's concern is clearly universal.
Even though Israel saw itself as uniquely chosen.
Yes. The priestly writers, deeply concerned with Israel's unique identity, especially after the exile, couldn't deny God's universal fatherhood, but reconciling that with their chosenness was complex. This Noahic covenant affirms God's care for everyone, placing all humanity and creation under his protective promise. The rainbow is for all. Of course, for Christians, this universality finds its ultimate expression in Jesus, where those divisions between Jew and Gentile are abolished. But Genesis lays the groundwork here. God's plan, God's blessing, is ultimately intended for all.
That really transforms the flood story, doesn't it? It's not just destruction. It's about collective responsibility, even for the good people, and it leads to this universal promise of God's grace and commitment to life. It pushes back against any idea that God's plan is only for one exclusive group. It embraces everything, which, thinking about our world today, so fractured and divided, that raises a big question, doesn't it? How do we truly recognize and live out that universality of God's love and concern? And how do we embrace that collective responsibility when things go wrong, not just blaming the other side, but acknowledging maybe our own adamantity, our own part in the failures. That's a challenge. The sons of Noah and the Tower of Babel. Nations and the danger of imposed unity. Genesis 9:8 and 11.9. All right, so after the flood, humanity gets a fresh start with Noah and his family. But, well, human nature seems to reassert itself pretty quickly. There's that strange incident where Noah, now a farmer, plants a vineyard, gets drunk, and passes out naked in his tent. His son Ham sees his father's nakedness and goes and tells his brothers, Shem and Japheth, who are outside. They react differently. They take a garment, walk backward into the tent so they don't see their father's nakedness, and cover him. When Noah wakes up and finds out what Ham, his youngest son, did, he pronounces a curse, but strangely, not on Ham directly, but on Ham's son, Canaan. Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. Then he blesses Shem and Japheth, saying Canaan will be their slave too.
Yeah, it's a difficult passage. The act itself, seeing the father's nakedness, seems minor to us, but in that cultural context, it likely represented a grave disrespect, perhaps even a challenge to patriarchal authority. Or maybe it hinted at something more taboo we don't fully grasp. The curse on Canaan rather than Ham is also puzzling, but it clearly functions as an etiological story for the later Israelites.
Etiological meaning it explains something later.
Exactly. It explains why the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land Israel would later conquer, were considered enemies destined for subjugation. It provides a kind of mythic justification for later historical conflicts and Israel's dominance over them. It links their perceived enemies back to this act of disrespect by their ancestor Ham.
So it's using this family incident to frame future national relationships.
Precisely. And following this, Genesis 10 gives us the Table of Nations. It lists the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, mapping out the known world of that time, explaining how the various peoples, languages, and territories came to be. It's like an ancient ethnography, tracing lineages. And again, you notice how nations Israel had conflicts with, like the Egyptians, Canaanites, Philistines, even Babylonians through Nimrod are often traced back to Ham.
It seems like history is being interpreted through these ancestral narratives.
Definitely. This Table of Nations is another step in that critical analysis of history by the Israelite sages. They're looking at the world, at the powerful empires that oppressed them, and trying to understand the origins of that conflict, the roots of evil in international relations. They identify figures like Ham, or Nimrod, described as the first warrior on earth, a founder of empires like Babel, as representing those forces responsible for historical evil, for the oppression of smaller nations. Again, it's not condemning ethnicity itself, but the actions associated with those groups: empire building, conquest, appropriation of resources and culture for oppressive ends. It's a critique of power structures.
Okay, that sets the stage for the next big story, the Tower of Babel. Genesis 11 starts by saying, now the whole world had one language and a common speech. Everyone's together, speaking the same language. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar, that's Babylonia, and settled there. They learned to make baked bricks, use tar for mortar advanced technology, and then they get this grand idea. Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth.
Ambition on a massive scale, reaching the heavens, making a name, resisting being scattered.
Exactly. But the Lord comes down to see the city and the tower they're building. And his reaction is interesting. He says, if as one people speaking the same language they've begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Quite. So he decides, come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. And result. The Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That's why it was called Babel, related to the Hebrew word for confuse, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world, scattering humanity.
Right. Now, this story is the absolute culmination of that critical analysis of history we've been tracing from Genesis 3 onwards. But the common interpretation, God punishing human pride or technological ambition, misses the deepest political point the sages were making. That phrase, one language or one speech, literally one lip or one mouth in Hebrew, likely isn't just about linguistics. In the political vocabulary of the ancient Near East, attested in archaeological finds, making peoples into one mouth meant political and economic subjugation.
So one mouth meant one ruler, one system imposed on everyone.
Precisely. It meant forcing everyone into the same tributary system, paying tribute to one single emperor, one dominating power. Think of the Assyrian or Babylonian empires. They sought to impose one mouth, their rule, their system, on conquered peoples. This involved immense suffering, violence, enslavement, destruction of local cultures and institutions, economic exploitation. That's the reality behind the unity described here.
Wow. So the tower and the city aren't just symbols of human pride, but symbols of imperial domination.
Exactly. It's a symbol of humanity building a system based on forced uniformity, control, and exploitation, centered in Babylon, Babel, the heart of the empire that had destroyed Jerusalem and exiled Israel. So when God comes down, it's not to punish progress. He comes down to dismantle this oppressive system. His action isn't primarily punishment, it's liberation. He confuses their language, disrupts their unified project of domination, and scatters them, breaking the empire's hold, allowing diversity and freedom to reemerge, even if it leads to separation.
So God's intervention is an act against totalitarianism, against forced, oppressive unity.
That's the radical interpretation the text offers. It completely flips the common reading. God acts to free the peoples from this subjugation. So Genesis 1:11 gives us this whole analysis of evil. It starts with individual egoism, the fall, escalates to violence in oppressive groups, Cain, involves betrayal even by the chosen. The flood requires critique of Israel too, expands through nations dominating the weak, Table of Nations, and reaches its peak when a perverted consciousness gains total power and imposes a single, unjust system, Babel.
That is a profoundly different reading and incredibly relevant. It gives us a completely different lens for looking at unity and diversity today. You think about globalization, this push towards, connectedness, sometimes towards uniformity. This story forces us to ask critical questions. Is this unity benefiting everyone equally? Is it respecting diverse cultures, economies, political identities? Or is it imposing one single mouth, one dominant system?
That's exactly the question it provokes.
It suggests that religion, rather than just accepting or blessing these systems, should play a role in raising awareness, in critiquing potentially oppressive forms of unity. So the provocative thought here is stark. Are we today building our own towers of Babel? Are we mistaking imposed uniformity or economic domination for genuine progress or unity? And are we ignoring the divine call to liberate, to foster diversity, to resist systems that seek to make everyone speak with one single mouth? It's a powerful challenge. 6. The patriarchal cycle. Abraham the call, the promises, and the tests. Genesis 11.27, 25.18. Okay, so after that sweeping overview of universal history and the origins of nations and conflict in Genesis 1:11, the narrative dramatically shifts focus, doesn't it? It zooms in.
Yes, it moves from the universal to the particular, from the origins of humanity in general to the origins of one specific people, Israel.
And it does this through the stories of their ancestors, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These aren't quite history in our modern sense, more like foundational legends.
Foundational legends, sagas, adventures. These stories were told and retold probably for centuries around campfires at festivals. They were revised, shaped over time. They were the way the people of Israel understood who they were, where they came from, and what their relationship with God was all about. They look back to these figures, especially Abraham, as the father of their faith, the starting point.
Right. So it all begins with this figure, later Abraham. He's introduced almost out of nowhere, living in Ur, then moving to Haran with his father. And then God breaks into his life unexpectedly. The call is direct and demanding. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. And it comes with huge promises. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you.
It's a pivotal moment. This divine call, this eruption into Abram's ordinary life completely changes its trajectory. It destabilizes him, sets him in motion.
And Abram, he just goes. He's 75 years old, the text says. He takes his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all their possessions, the people they acquired in Haran, and sets out for this unknown land, Canaan.
That obedience is key. Now, nomadic movements weren't uncommon then, but Abram's journey is presented differently. First, it's initiated by a direct divine command. Second, it requires profound faith and obedience. Third, it's a definitive move, not just seasonal migration based on these huge promises. Land, descendants as numerous as stars, and this universal blessing. And fourth, when he arrives in Canaan, he builds altars at Shechem, near Bethel. He's not just passing through, he's claiming a connection to this land through worship, establishing a permanent presence linked to this God who called him.
But there's a tension there, isn't there? God promises him this land, Canaan, but people already live there.
Exactly. And we, as modern readers, especially with our awareness of justice issues, can struggle with that. It can sound like God is just giving away land that belongs to others. We have to remember two things. First, the Bible is both God's word and human word. It's mediated through the writer's own perspective, their historical context, their understanding of God's promises for them. They presented God's will as aligning with their national aspirations. Second, we need to apply that key of justice we talked about earlier. How does this promise of land square with God's universal character of justice and love? Later parts of the Bible itself will wrestle with this, demanding justice for the foreigner and the resident alien. But here, the focus is on the beginning of Israel's story and the foundation of their claim to the land through divine promise.
Okay, that's a helpful framing. Now, Abram's journey, his life of faith, it wasn't exactly smooth sailing, was it? The Bible is surprisingly honest about his flaws.
Oh, absolutely. It doesn't whitewash its heroes.
Right, like almost immediately after arriving, there's a famine. So Abram goes down to Egypt, and fearing for his life because Sarai is beautiful, he tells her, "Say you're my sister." So the Egyptians will treat him well because of her.
A rather cowardly and self-serving plan, putting his wife at risk.
Totally. And it works initially. Sarai is taken into Pharaoh's palace. Abram gets wealthy sheep, cattle, servants, camels because of her. But then the Lord strikes Pharaoh's household with plagues because of Sarai. Pharaoh figures out the deception, is furious with Abram, rebukes him sharply, and kicks them out of Egypt, albeit with all the stuff Abram acquired.
It's a pattern we see repeated later with Abraham and Isaac and Gerar as well, this wife-sister ruse.
What's the significance of that recurring story?
Well, on one level, it reflects ancient social customs, maybe realities about protecting women or navigating foreign powers. But theologically, it does a couple of things. It highlights the patriarchs' flaws, their lack of faith in God's protection. But paradoxically, it also shows God protecting them despite their flaws. And interestingly, it often portrays the foreign rulers, like Pharaoh or Abimelech of Gerar, as having a certain fear of God or sense of justice, sometimes more than the patriarch himself in that moment. It subtly shows God's influence extends beyond Israel, and it presents Abraham as a prophet, someone whose connection to God has consequences even for kings. It shows the evolving understanding of God's reach and power.
Interesting. Okay, other key moments in Abram's early journey. The separation from Lot.
Right. Their flocks become too large, their herdsmen quarrel. Abram generously gives Lot the choice of land. Lot chooses the well-watered Jordan plain near the infamous cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abram stays in Canaan. It sets up Lot's separate storyline and reinforces Abram's connection to the Promised Land.
And then the rescue of Lot, where Abram acts like a warrior.
Yes. Lot gets captured in a regional war. Abram, now called the Hebrew, musters his 318 trained men, defeats the victorious kings, and rescues Lot. It shows Abram as a capable leader, respected, powerful in his own right. And on his return, he has that mysterious encounter with Melchizedek, king of Salem, likely Jerusalem, priest of God Most High. Melchizedek blesses Abram, Abram gives him a tithe. It's a fascinating link to a pre-existing priesthood and worship of the same God, suggesting Abram's faith connects to something ancient.
And then God formalizes the promise with that covenant ceremony.
Yes, in Genesis 15, Abram is still childless. Worried his servant Eliezer will be his heir, God reassures him, "No, a son coming from your own body will be your heir." He takes him outside. "Look at the stars, so shall your offspring be." And crucially, Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Faith is the key. Then comes that strange, rather terrifying covenant ritual. Animals cut in half, laid out. Abram falls into a deep sleep. God, symbolized by a smoking firepot and blazing torch, passes between the pieces.
What did that signify? Passing between the pieces.
Normally, both parties making a covenant would pass between the pieces, essentially saying, "May this happen to me if I break the deal." But here, significantly, only God passes through. It means the covenant, the promise of land and descendants, is unilateral. It depends entirely on God's faithfulness, not Abram's. God binds himself to the promise. And within that vision, God also foretells the descendants' slavery in Egypt for 400 years, followed by their deliverance with great possessions. Again, this is likely reflecting back on Israel's known history, framing it as part of God's long-term plan revealed to Abram.
Okay, but the promise of a son, that still takes time and leads to more complications.
Indeed. Sarai remains barren, so she takes matters into her own hands, following a custom of the time. She gives her Egyptian slave Hagar to Abram to bear a child for her.
And Ishmael is born. Abram is 86. But years later, when Abram is 99, God appears again, renews the covenant, changes his name to Abraham, father of many nations, changes Sarai's name to Sarah, princess, and promises definitively. Sarah herself will bear a son, Isaac. God establishes circumcision as the physical sign of this everlasting covenant.
A permanent mark distinguishing the covenant people.
And Isaac is born, just as God promised. Abraham is 100.
But this creates new tensions. Sarah sees Ishmael, now a teenager, maybe mocking Isaac, or maybe just playing in a way she dislikes. She gets fiercely protective, maybe jealous. She demands Abraham cast out Hagar and Ishmael, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. Abraham is distressed. Ishmael is his son too. But God tells him to listen to Sarah, reaffirming that the covenant line will be through Isaac. But God also promises to make Ishmael into a great nation because he is Abraham's offspring. So Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael away with just some bread and water. They wander in the desert, the water runs out. Hagar expects them to die. But God hears Ishmael's cry. An angel speaks to Hagar, reiterates the promise for Ishmael, and shows her a well. They survive.
This is another one of those deeply troubling stories ethically. The founding story of the later antagonism between Israelites and Ishmaelites, Arabs. But look at the raw injustice done to Hagar and Ishmael, driven out at Sarah's insistence, seemingly with God's okay. Again, we have to filter this through our understanding of God's character. Can we really attribute such cruelty, such disregard for a woman and child directly to the God of love and justice? Or is this narrative reflecting human failings, jealousies, and social realities, attributing them to divine will to justify the outcome Israel's primacy? Invoking religious reasons to expel people, to marginalize the other, is something the Bible itself elsewhere condemns. It's a reminder that Scripture contains human perspectives that need critical evaluation in light of God's revealed nature. God's care for Hagar and Ishmael, despite their expulsion, is also significant, though.
That's a crucial distinction. The text records it, but we don't have to endorse the human actions or motivations presented as God's will. Which brings us to perhaps the most challenging story of all, the binding of Isaac, the Akedah. God tests Abraham, telling him, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you."
That's devastating, unthinkable.
Abraham obeys, gets up early, prepares everything, takes Isaac and 2 servants, travels 3 days. He tells the servants to wait while he and Isaac go worship. Isaac, carrying the wood, asks that heartbreaking question. "Father, the fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham's reply is heavy with double meaning. "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." They reach the place. Abraham builds the altar, arranges the wood, binds his son Isaac, lays him on the altar, raises the knife.
The tension is unbearable.
And the angel of the Lord calls out, "Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looks up, sees a ram caught in a thicket. He sacrifices the ram instead of his son, and God reiterates the covenant promises because of Abraham's absolute obedience.
Okay, this story cannot be understood as God literally demanding child sacrifice. That interpretation is abhorrent and contradicts everything else revealed about God's character. This is a story about the evolution of religious consciousness. Abraham lived in a culture where child sacrifice, especially of the firstborn, was practiced, sometimes believed necessary to guarantee future fertility or appease angry gods. The story reflects Abraham wrestling with the perceived demands of the divine within his cultural context. The test isn't God being cruel, it's a narrative device exploring the absolute limits of faith and obedience, while simultaneously revealing that this God, the God of Abraham, is radically different. The climax isn't the willingness to kill, but the revelation that God doesn't want human sacrifice. He wants life. He provides the substitute. It's a polemic against child sacrifice, showing that Abraham's God values life and commitment, not ritual killing.
So the test is more about Abraham moving beyond the primitive religious assumptions of his time.
Exactly. It's about discovering the true nature of the God he follows. The temptation here isn't God tempting Abraham to do evil. It's the temptation within human religious consciousness to project onto God our own fears, our own cultural assumptions, even our willingness to do terrible things if we think it pleases the divine. The story ultimately affirms life and God's provision, repudiating the very practice it seems to depict. It teaches that true fear of God leads to cherishing life, not destroying it.
That reframing is essential. It turns a horrifying story into one about religious breakthrough. But it still leaves us with that uncomfortable question you raised earlier. How often do we, perhaps unconsciously, attribute our own desires, fears, or even prejudices to God's will? How often do communities invoke divine mandate to justify actions that, if we're honest, contradict the core principles of justice, mercy, and love? It's a constant call for discernment, isn't it? 7. The patriarchal cycle. Isaac and Jacob, rivalry and redemption. Genesis 25.1 through this point 43. Okay, so the torch passes from Abraham to his son Isaac. Isaac's story seems quieter, less dramatic than Abraham's or his own son Jacob's, but there are key moments. Like Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and his wife Rebekah are initially barren. Isaac prays, Rebekah conceives twins. But the pregnancy is difficult. The twins struggle within her. Rebekah asks God why, and God gives her that oracle we mentioned. 2 nations are in your womb, 2 peoples. One will be stronger, the older will serve the younger. Setting the stage for conflict right from the start. Destiny, or perhaps an explanation for later realities, is foretold. Exactly. The twins are born. Esau comes first, red and hairy, a skillful hunter and outdoorsman. Isaac loves him, especially his game. Jacob comes out grasping Esau's heel. The name Jacob relates to heel or supplanter. He's a quiet man, preferring tents. Rebekah loves Jacob. Parental favoritism is right there.
A recipe for family trouble.
Absolutely. And the first clash comes early. Esau comes in famished from hunting. Jacob's cooking lentil stew. Esau begs for some. Jacob, ever the opportunist, says, "Sell me your birthright first." The birthright meant leadership of the family, a double share of the inheritance. Esau, impulsive and thinking only of his immediate hunger, despises his birthright. "I'm about to die. What good is it?" He swears an oath, sells it for a bowl of stew.
A rash decision with long-term consequences, highlighting the difference in their characters. Esau driven by appetite, Jacob by calculation.
Years later, the rivalry escalates dramatically. Isaac is old, blind. He wants to give Esau the final, powerful patriarchal blessing before he dies. Sends Esau out to hunt and prepare his favorite meal. But Rebekah overhears. She quickly orchestrates a deception. She dresses Jacob in Esau's clothes, covers his smooth hands and neck with goat skins to mimic Esau's hairiness, prepares a tasty meal herself. Jacob goes into his blind father. Isaac is suspicious. The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. But the feel of the goat skins, the smell of Esau's clothes convinces him. He gives Jacob the blessing intended for Esau, the blessing of dew from heaven, richness of the earth, abundance, dominion over nations, even over his own brothers.
A stolen blessing. Deception at the heart of the family.
Esau returns, finds out he's been cheated. His reaction is heartbreaking, a loud, bitter cry. He begs his father for any blessing. Isaac gives him a secondary, harsher one, predicting a life away from the earth's richness, living by the sword, serving his brother, though eventually breaking free. Esau is filled with hatred, vows to kill Jacob after their father dies. Rebekah, fearing for Jacob's life, convinces Isaac to send Jacob away to her brother Laban in Paddan Aram, ostensibly to find a wife from their own people, but really to escape Esau's wrath.
Okay, so this whole narrative, Esau and Jacob, it's another etiology, isn't it? It's explaining the origins of the later nations of Edom from Esau and Israel from Jacob, and their often hostile relationship. It justifies Israel's eventual dominance over Edom by tracing it back to Esau losing the birthright and blessing. It reflects Israel's perspective on their history with their neighbor.
But it doesn't exactly paint Jacob in a flattering light either.
Not at all. And that's the Bible's honesty again. Jacob the supplanter, the trickster, achieves his position through deceit. The text doesn't explicitly condemn him here, but it doesn't hide his actions. And importantly, this sets up the law of retribution theme. Jacob deceived his father. Later, he himself will be deceived repeatedly by his father-in-law, Laban. What goes around, comes around. The narrative implicitly holds Jacob accountable, even as it traces God's improbable plan working through him.
Right. So Jacob flees, and on his journey, he has that famous dream at Bethel. He stops for the night, uses a stone for a pillow, dreams of a ladder or maybe a stairway reaching from earth to heaven with angels going up and down. God stands above it, reaffirms the promises made to Abraham and Isaac land, descendants, blessing for all nations through him, and crucially, God's presence. "I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go." Jacob wakes up terrified, awestruck. "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven." He sets up the stone as a pillar, calls the place Bethel, house of God, and makes a vow.
A powerful experience of God's presence, even for someone on the run, someone morally compromised. It shows God's grace meeting Jacob where he is. The ladder connects heaven and earth. God is accessible, involved in human affairs.
Jacob eventually reaches Haran, meets his uncle Laban, and falls instantly in love with Laban's younger daughter, the beautiful Rachel. He agrees to work for Laban for 7 years to marry her. The years fly by because of his love for her, but on the wedding night, Laban tricks him, switches daughters in the darkness. Jacob wakes up married to Leah, the older sister, who had weak eyes, perhaps meaning she wasn't considered as attractive.
The deceiver gets deceived. Retribution begins.
Exactly. Jacob is furious. Laban makes excuses about custom older must marry before younger. He agrees to give Rachel to Jacob as well, but only after Leah's bridal week is over, and in exchange for another 7 years of work. Jacob agrees. So now Jacob has 2 wives, sisters, rivals. And this rivalry plays out through childbearing. God sees Leah as unloved, so he opens her womb. She bears Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. Rachel remains barren, desperately envious. She gives her servant Bilhah to Jacob, who has Dan and Naphtali by her. Leah, perhaps past childbearing age, gives her servant Zilpah to Jacob, who has Gad and Asher. Then Leah herself bears Issachar, Zebulun, and finally a daughter, Dinah. Only then does God remember Rachel, opens her womb, and she bears Joseph. The 12 sons, the future tribes of Israel, are born amidst this complex web of rivalry, surrogacy, and Jacob's complicated family life.
It's a messy origin story, but it highlights the diversity within Israel right from the start. Different mothers, different statuses, wives versus servants' sons. It also shows God's hand, even in the mess. Leah, the unloved wife, becomes the mother of key tribes, including Judah, the royal line, and Levi, the priestly line. God works through unexpected channels.
Jacob eventually wants to leave Laban after 20 years. He's prospered largely through his own cunning in managing Laban's flocks, using folk beliefs about breeding to increase his own share. He flees secretly with his wives, children, and vast possessions. Rachel, without Jacob knowing, steals Laban's teraphim, his household gods or idols.
Those were likely small figures, maybe used for divination or considered protective family emblems representing inheritance rights, perhaps. Rachel's motive isn't entirely clear. Maybe security, maybe a final act of defiance against her father.
Laban pursues them, furious about the idols and the secret departure, but God warns Laban in a dream not to harm Jacob. They have a tense confrontation. Laban searches for the idols. Rachel cleverly hides them by sitting on them, claiming she's menstruating and can't get up. Jacob, unaware of the theft, indignantly proclaims his innocence and lists Laban's unfair treatment over the years. Finally, they make a treaty, a non-aggression pact. They set up a pillar and a heap of stones, name the place Gilead, keep a witness, swear not to harm each other. It marks the boundary between them.
Again, we see the theme of retribution, Laban's deception answered by Jacob's cunning departure. We also see God's protection over Jacob, even intervening in Laban's dream. And the need for clear boundaries and treaties between potentially rival groups in that region is reflected in the covenant they make. It's about survival and coexistence in a potentially hostile world.
So Jacob is finally heading back towards Canaan, towards the inevitable encounter with Esau. He's understandably terrified, sends messengers ahead with gifts to appease his brother. The night before the meeting, Jacob sends his family across the Jabbok River. He stays behind, alone. And there, a mysterious man wrestles with him until daybreak. Jacob holds on even when the man touches his hip socket and wrenches it. He refuses to let go until the man blesses him. The man asks his name, Jacob. Then the man declares, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." He blesses him there. Jacob calls the place Peniel, face of God, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared."
A profound, transformative encounter. Jacob the trickster wrestles directly with the divine, persists, demands a blessing, and receives a new name. Israel, he struggles with God. It signifies a change, a new identity forged through struggle. He's no longer just the supplanter. He's one who engages directly with God, even contends with him, and prevails in a sense.
And the next day, limping from his injury, he meets Esau. Esau runs to him, embraces him, kisses him, weeps. The feared confrontation turns into reconciliation. Jacob insists Esau accept his lavish gifts. Esau eventually does. Esau offers to travel with him, but Jacob, perhaps still cautious, perhaps just wanting his own space, politely declines and sends Esau on ahead. They part ways amicably, but separately. Jacob settles first in Sukkoth, then near Shechem, buys land, builds an altar to Elohe Israel, God, the God of Israel.
The reconciliation is a moment of grace, showing that past wrongs can be overcome. Esau's generosity is striking. But their separation also reflects the historical reality. Israel and Edom remain distinct peoples, neighbors, sometimes rivals, despite their shared ancestry. Jacob, now Israel, establishes himself firmly back in the Promised Land.
But trouble finds the family even there. The story of Dinah. Dinah, Jacob and Leah's daughter, goes out to visit the women of Shechem. The local prince, also named Shechem, seizes her, violates her. Afterwards, though, the text says he was deeply attracted to her, loved her, and wanted to marry her. He asks his father Hamor to arrange it with Jacob. Jacob hears about it, but waits for his sons to return from the fields. They are furious, feeling their sister and the family honor have been defiled. Hamor and Shechem propose intermarriage between their peoples, offering land and trade. But Dinah's brothers, particularly Simeon and Levi, respond deceitfully. They say they can only agree if all the Shechemite men are circumcised, like them. The Shechemites, eager for the alliance and the potential wealth, agree. All the men are circumcised. On the third day, when the men are sore and vulnerable, Simeon and Levi take their swords, storm the unsuspecting city, kill every male, including Hamor and Shechem, plunder everything, and rescue Dinah.
Brutal, disproportionate vengeance.
Jacob is horrified, but mainly about the consequences. "You have brought trouble on me by making me obnoxious to the Canaanites. We are few in number. If they join forces against me and attack me, I and my household will be destroyed." Simeon and Levi retort, "Should he have treated our sister like a prostitute?"
This violent episode serves, again, as an etiology. It explains why the tribes of Simeon and Levi didn't receive distinct territorial inheritances later on. Unlike the other tribes, Levi became the priestly tribe, dispersed among the others. Simeon was absorbed into Judah. Their ancestors' violence had negative long-term consequences, according to this tradition. It's the Bible's way of condemning vengeance and suggesting that establishing oneself in the land through such brutality is not God's way. It contrasts sharply with Abraham buying land peacefully. The incident also provides a narrative reason for Jacob and his family to move on from Shechem, eventually heading towards Bethel, fulfilling the vow Jacob made after his dream and reinforcing Bethel's importance, especially for the northern traditions of Israel.
So again, these complex, often violent stories are doing multiple things, reflecting human realities like rivalry, deception, vengeance, but also explaining later tribal relationships, wrestling with questions of justice and consequences, and showing God's plan somehow unfolding even amidst the human mess. It's never simple, is it? 8. The patriarchal cycle. Joseph from slave to ruler and the grace that redeems, Genesis 37.1, 50.26. And that brings us to the final major section of Genesis, the story of Joseph. It feels almost like a novella embedded in the book.
It does. It's a beautifully structured narrative focusing on Jacob's favorite son, Joseph.
Right. Jacob, now called Israel, loves Joseph more than any of his other sons, partly because he was born in his old age to his beloved wife Rachel. He gives Joseph that famous coat, often translated coat of many colors, but maybe more accurately a special robe with long sleeves, possibly signifying authority or favoritism. This favoritism naturally breeds jealousy among his 10 older half-brothers, and Joseph doesn't help things. He has these dreams.
Dreams are very important in this story, signs of divine communication.
Yes. He dreams their sheaves of grain bow down to his sheaf. Then he dreams the sun, moon, and 11 stars are bowing down to him. He tells these dreams to his brothers and even to his father. His brother's reaction, pure hatred and envy. Even Jacob rebukes him for the second dream, though the text says he kept the matter in mind.
The dreams clearly predict Joseph's future exaltation over his family.
So the tension is high. One day, Jacob sends Joseph, now 17, out to check on his brothers who are grazing the flocks near Shechem, quite a distance away. They see him coming in the distance, wearing that coat, and the hatred boils over. Here comes that dreamer. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Reuben, the oldest, tries to intervene, maybe out of responsibility, maybe guilt over an earlier incident with Jacob's concubine. He suggests just throwing Joseph into a cistern alive, planning to rescue him later. But while Reuben is away, Judah has another idea. He sees a caravan of Ishmaelites or Midianites, the text seems to weave traditions here, heading towards Egypt. Judah argues, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. His brothers agree. So they pull Joseph out of the cistern, strip him of his robe, and sell him for 20 shekels of silver. The merchants take him off to Egypt. To cover their crime, they kill a goat, dip Joseph's robe in the blood, and take it back to Jacob. We found this. Examine it to see if it is your son's robe. Jacob recognizes it immediately. It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. He tears his clothes, puts on sackcloth, and mourns for days, refusing all comfort, convinced his favorite son is dead.
A brutal betrayal, fueled by envy. And notice the echo of deception again. Jacob, the deceiver, is now tragically deceived by his own sons. The text highlights this, perhaps as part of that retribution theme. But unlike Jacob's earlier deceptions, this one has devastating emotional consequences for him, though ultimately God will turn it towards a surprisingly positive outcome for the family. It shows God working even through and despite human sin.
Meanwhile, Joseph arrives in Egypt as a slave. He's bought by Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. But things start looking up for Joseph, even in slavery. The text emphasizes the Lord was with Joseph. He found favor with Potiphar, who saw that the Lord made everything Joseph did prosper. Potiphar promotes him, puts him in charge of his entire household. Everything thrives under Joseph's management. Potiphar trusts him completely. Joseph is also described as well-built and handsome.
Success and integrity, even in difficult circumstances. God's presence is key.
But this leads to another trial. Potiphar's wife notices Joseph. Day after day, she tries to seduce him. Come to bed with me.
Joseph consistently refuses. His reasoning is remarkable. My master trusts me. He hasn't withheld anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? He frames it as loyalty to his master and faithfulness to God. She persists. One day, when they're alone in the house, she grabs his cloak, demanding he lie with her. He runs out, leaving the cloak in her hand. Humiliated, furious, she flips the story. She screams, calls the servants, claims Joseph, the Hebrew slave, came in to insult her, tried to rape her, and ran out, leaving his cloak when she screamed. When Potiphar comes home and hears her story, he's enraged. He throws Joseph into the royal prison where the king's prisoners were kept.
So Joseph's integrity leads directly to injustice and imprisonment. This is presented as an exemplary tale, perhaps drawing on Egyptian folklore motifs, but adapted to show Israelite virtue. Joseph acts righteously, according to God's law, even when it costs him dearly. It seems like things have gone terribly wrong again, but the narrative immediately adds,
The Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Even in prison, Joseph's character and God's blessing shine through. The warden puts Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners. Everything runs smoothly under Joseph's oversight because, again, the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did.
It's a pattern. Faithfulness leads to apparent disaster, but God remains present, working behind the scenes, preparing the next step.
And that next step comes via more dreams. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker offend the king and end up in the same prison. One night, they both have disturbing dreams and are troubled. Joseph notices their downcast faces, asks why. They say they had dreams, but there's no one to interpret them. Joseph replies, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. The cupbearer describes his dream. Fine grapes pressing them into Pharaoh's cup. Joseph interprets, In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up and restore you to your position. He asks the cupbearer to remember him and mention him to Pharaoh when he's released. The baker, encouraged, tells his dream. Baskets of bread on his head, birds eating from them. Joseph's interpretation is grim. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat your flesh. And exactly 3 days later, on Pharaoh's birthday, it happens precisely as Joseph predicted. The cupbearer is restored, the baker is executed. But the cupbearer, he forgets Joseph.
For 2 whole years, another period of waiting, of seeming abandonment, Joseph's reliance must be solely on God.
Then Pharaoh himself has dreams that deeply trouble him. First, 7 sleek, fat cows come out of the Nile, followed by 7 ugly, gaunt cows that eat the fat ones but remain gaunt. Then, 7 healthy, full heads of grain are swallowed by 7 thin, scorched heads of grain. None of Egypt's magicians or wise men can interpret these dreams. Suddenly, the chief cupbearer remembers. Today I am reminded of my shortcomings. There was a young Hebrew man. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them. Pharaoh immediately sends for Joseph. He's rushed out of the dungeon, shaves, changes his clothes, and is brought before the ruler of Egypt. Pharaoh describes the dreams. Joseph's response is crucial. I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. He deflects all credit to God. He interprets. The 2 dreams are one. God is showing Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout Egypt, followed by 7 years of devastating famine that will ravage the land, so severe the abundance will be forgotten. He then offers practical advice. Pharaoh should appoint a wise and discerning man over Egypt, set up officials to collect 1/5 of the harvest during the good years, store the grain in cities under Pharaoh's control as reserves for the famine years, so the country won't perish.
From dream interpreter to policy advisor in one stroke.
Pharaoh and his officials are incredibly impressed, Pharaoh declares. Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Haway. Just like that, Joseph, the former slave and prisoner, becomes vizier, the second most powerful man in Egypt. Pharaoh gives him his signet ring, fine linen robes, a gold chain, a chariot, gives him an Egyptian name, marries him to the daughter of an Egyptian priest. Joseph travels throughout Egypt, organizing the massive grain collection during the 7 years of abundance. He has 2 sons, Manasseh, God has made me forget all my trouble, and Ephraim, God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. Then the famine hits, just as predicted. It's severe, not just in Egypt, but in all the surrounding lands. And people from all over the world start coming to Egypt, to Joseph, to buy grain.
A remarkable reversal of fortune, clearly attributed to God's providence working through Joseph's wisdom and faithfulness. The dreams are fulfilled in ways no one could have imagined. But there's a deeply critical layer to this part of the story, too, often overlooked. As the famine bites harder, Joseph implements Pharaoh's policy.
Which is?
First, he collects all the money in Egypt and Canaan in exchange for grain. When the money runs out, he takes the people's livestock. When that's gone, the people come desperate. Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We will be Pharaoh's slaves.
So Joseph acquires all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, except the priest land, who had their own royal provision. He moves the people into cities and makes them essentially serfs, tenants on Pharaoh's land, obligated to give Pharaoh 1/5 of their future produce in exchange for seed and survival.
Wow.
So Joseph the hero presides over this massive transfer of wealth and land, basically enslaving the entire population to the state.
Exactly. And while the narrative presents Joseph as the wise administrator saving lives, the way it's done is a stark picture of imperial economic policy that leads to total dependency and impoverishment of the populace. The text doesn't explicitly say this is evil, but by describing the process so clinically, it offers a profound, subtle critique. This is the salvation offered by empire. Bread, yes, but at the cost of freedom, land, and dignity. It's the very opposite of the life-giving, liberating plan God intended in Genesis 1:11. It shows how even a system managed by a good person favored by God can become profoundly oppressive. It's a critique of the system itself.
That adds such a complex, almost tragic layer to Joseph's success. It forces us to look critically at solutions that seem practical but have devastating human costs. It really makes you ask, doesn't it? How often today are people forced to accept exploitative conditions just to survive? How often is aid or development structured in ways that ultimately benefit the powerful and create dependency, even if managed by well-intentioned individuals? It's a powerful warning against confusing pragmatic administration with true justice. Okay, so the famine drives the narrative towards its climax, the reunion. Jacob hears there's grain in Egypt, sends his 10 older sons to buy some, keeping Benjamin, Rachel's only other son, at home, fearing harm might come to him too. The brothers arrive in Egypt, come before Joseph, the powerful vizier, and bow down low, fulfilling the first dream, though they have no idea who he is. Joseph recognizes them immediately, but he pretends not to, speaks harshly, accuses them of being spies. To test them, he demands they prove their story by bringing their youngest brother Benjamin back to Egypt. He throws them in prison for 3 days, then releases all but Simeon, whom he keeps as a hostage. They return to Jacob, distraught, finding the silver they paid for the grain mysteriously returned in their sacks, another test by Joseph, which terrifies them. Jacob is devastated at the thought of losing Benjamin too, after Joseph and now Simeon. Everything is against me. But the famine persists. Judah steps up, passionately pleads with Jacob, promising to personally guarantee Benjamin's safety. Jacob finally, reluctantly agrees. They go back to Egypt with double the silver, gifts, and Benjamin. Joseph is overjoyed to see Benjamin, his full brother. He arranges a feast for them, then goes the final test. Joseph orders his steward to fill their sacks with grain, return their silver again, and hide his personal silver divination cup in Benjamin's sack. As they leave the city, Joseph sends his steward after them. The cup is found in Benjamin's sack. The brothers are horrified, tear their clothes, return to the city. Joseph confronts them, says the one with the cup must become his slave. Judah steps forward again, makes an incredibly moving speech. He explains Jacob's deep love for Benjamin, how losing him would kill their father. He recounts his own promise to Jacob. Then he offers himself. Let me stay behind as my lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers.
A complete transformation. Judah, who suggested selling Joseph into slavery, now offers himself as a slave to save Benjamin and spare his father. It shows genuine repentance, selfless love. The test worked.
Joseph can't stand it anymore. He orders all the Egyptians out of the room, breaks down weeping loudly, and reveals himself. I am Joseph. Is my father still living? His brothers are terrified, speechless. But Joseph reassures them, urges them closer. Do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here. And then he delivers that incredible line, the theological heart of the whole story, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. It was not you who sent me here, but God. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. He embraces them all, weeping, forgiveness, reconciliation.
It's one of the most powerful statements of theodicy, God's justice in the face of evil in the entire Bible. Joseph acknowledges their sin, their harmful intent. You intended to harm me. He doesn't minimize it, but he sees beyond it to God's sovereign purpose, but God intended it for good. God didn't cause their sin, but he was able to weave even their malicious actions into his larger plan of preservation and redemption. It's a profound message of hope, showing that God's good purposes can ultimately triumph even over human evil and failure.
So Joseph sends his brothers back with provisions and wagons to bring Jacob and the entire extended family, 70 people in total, down to Egypt to escape the remaining years of famine. Pharaoh approves, gives them the best land in Egypt, the region of Goshen. Jacob's journey down, the emotional reunion with Joseph, after believing him dead for over 20 years, it's incredibly moving. Jacob says, "Now I'm ready to die, since I've seen for myself that you are still alive." Jacob lives 17 more years in Egypt. He blesses Pharaoh. Before he dies, he makes Joseph swear to bury him back in Canaan, in the family tomb at Machpelah, with Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah. Not in Egypt. He also formally adopts Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, as his own, elevating them to the status of his other sons, the future tribal leaders. And in blessing them, he deliberately crosses his hands, giving the greater blessing to the younger son Ephraim over the older Manasseh, echoing the theme of the younger supplanting the older. Then, in a final poetic testament, Jacob gathers all 12 sons and gives each a blessing, or sometimes a critique, foretelling their future tribal characteristics and destinies. He audibly reaffirms the promised leadership, even kingship, to Judah, and predicts great prosperity for Joseph's descendants. Jacob dies. Joseph organizes a huge funeral procession, including Egyptian officials, to take Jacob's body back to Canaan for burial. After Jacob's death, the brothers worry Joseph might finally take revenge. They send him a message, invoking their father's dying wish for forgiveness. Joseph weeps, reassures them again with that theme. "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Joseph lives to a ripe old age, 110, sees his great-grandchildren. Before he dies, he too makes the Israelites swear an oath. "God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place." He wants to be buried in the Promised Land eventually. They embalm him, place him in a coffin in Egypt, awaiting that future exodus.
That final insistence by both Jacob and Joseph on burial in Canaan is hugely significant. It's a powerful symbol. Egypt, despite being a place of refuge and Joseph's success, is ultimately not the goal. In the larger biblical narrative, Egypt comes to represent slavery, oppression, death, the antithesis of God's liberating plan. Their desire to be buried in Canaan is an act of faith, a statement that their ultimate hope and destiny lie in the land God promised, not in the empire where they currently reside. It points forward, setting the stage for the next chapter: Israel's enslavement in Egypt and their eventual liberation in the Exodus.
So the ending of Genesis looks forward to the beginning of Exodus.
Exactly. The deaths of Jacob and Joseph mark the end of the patriarchal era. The focus shifts from these larger-than-life individuals and their family dramas to the collective fate of the people of Israel in Egypt. Genesis ends with Joseph in a coffin in Egypt, but with a promise of future return to the land. It's an ending full of hope and anticipation for God's next move.
What an incredible sweep of stories. The Joseph cycle really brings it all together. Family conflict, betrayal, suffering, unexpected success, the complexities of power, and ultimately this profound sense of God's providence working through it all. It teaches so much about forgiveness, about seeing God's hands, even in terrible circumstances, about loyalty, and about keeping faith in a larger promise even when you're living in exile or just difficult times. And that final point about Egypt versus Canaan, it really makes you think, if these ancient stories, written in such different contexts, reveal these dynamics of power, justice, exploitation, and liberation that feel so immediate, so relevant to us now, what else are we missing? What other deep truths are lying there waiting for us if we read these texts or even our own history with that key of justice, that key of life that Genesis seems to offer? It's a challenge to keep digging deeper, isn't it? Outro. Wow, what an incredible journey that was, diving deep into these foundational stories of Genesis, from creation to the patriarchs. It's a lot. We've seen how these narratives, when we read them not just as simple tales, but look at their context, their layers, especially through that lens of justice and liberation you mentioned, offer such profound lessons. Lessons about being human, about God, about evil, forgiveness, politics, economics, divine providence. It's all in there.
It really is. They aren't just stories about what happened way back then. They're about what matters, what always matters. They give us a framework, a way to read and understand not just Israel's history, but maybe our own history, too personal and collective. They challenge us to evaluate our actions, our societies against God's standards of justice and life, which, as we saw repeatedly, are ultimately about liberation and flourishing for everyone.
And that leaves us with a final thought, maybe a provocative one to chew on. If Genesis shows us a God who can transform the evil intentions of Joseph's brothers into good for many, or who can turn an act of imperial domination like the Tower of Babel into an act of liberation, scattering people into freedom, then what does that mean for us, for you today? What role do we play in that ongoing story of life and justice? How can we become agents of that kind of divine transformation in our own world, actively seeking good, equity, liberation for all, especially for those who seem forgotten or oppressed by the towers we build today? Genesis seems to suggest that's part of our calling, part of being made in the image of a liberating God. We invite you to keep wrestling with these ideas, keep seeking that wisdom that helps us navigate the complexities of our world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time on The Deep Dive.